Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into something more terrifying than a haunted house, more cutthroat than a medieval siege, and infinitely more dangerous than sailing the open seas in 1717. Tonight, we are talking about the fashion industry in the 1980s, specifically what it was like to be a woman inside it. Not the glamour, not the shoulder pads and the supermodels and the Vogue covers, the real version. The version with the casting directors who looked you up and down like you were a used car. The agency contracts that basically signed your soul away in exchange for a subway card and the sample sizes that fit approximately no human being who has ever existed anywhere on Earth at any point in human history. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a very genuine, very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this one is for you. Comments like yours are why this channel exists, and every suggestion shapes where we go next. If you want to leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, please do. It is always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen on the go, the link is in the description below. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull your weighted blanket up to your chin and settle in, because tonight we're going somewhere loud, fluorescent, and aggressively overdressed. Let's pause for a moment, because before we dive in, you deserve to ask yourself some questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to walk into a casting call wearing your best outfit, only to be told your hips were 1/4 of an inch too wide for the sample? Did the women who appeared in those glossy magazines cry in bathroom stalls between shows? Did they eat? Like, actually eat? What happened to the ones who didn't make it? What happened to the ones who did? Was there a single person in that entire glittering industry who looked at a 19-year-old girl fresh off a bus from Ohio and thought, maybe we should be kind to this one? And what was it like to build an entire career on your face, your body, your bone structure, only to be told at 26 that you were, and I quote, aging out? Congratulations. You have just woken up in 1982. You're standing outside an agency in Midtown Manhattan. Your portfolio is under your arm. Your heels are half a size too small because that was all they had at the consignment shop. Your hair has been teased to a height not found in nature. And somewhere inside that building, a man you have never met is about to decide whether your nose is commercially viable. Good luck. You did not find the fashion industry in the 1980s. It found you, usually when you were about 15, standing in a mall in a mid-sized American city, and a stranger walked up to you while you were eating a pretzel and told you that you had a look. That was the word. A look. Not beauty, not talent, not charisma. A look. As if you were a piece of furniture that happened to have cheekbones. From that moment forward, the machine began its quiet, relentless work, pulling you in the direction of New York or Paris or Milan, with the slow, powerful gravity of something that had been doing this for decades and knew exactly how it ended. The stranger was usually a scout. Sometimes they worked for an agency directly. Sometimes they were freelancers who got a finder's fee for delivering promising faces to the right people. They had the practiced confidence of someone who did this often, and they handed you a card with a phone number and told you to call, and something about the way they said it made it feel less like an invitation, and more like a fact that had already been decided. You were going to call. Of course you were going to call. You were 15 and someone had just told you that you were special in the specific language that 15-year-olds find most convincing. Your parents drove you to the agency, or they put you on a plane, or in the most ambitious cases they relocated the entire family, because the scout had been persuasive, and the possibilities had been described in a way that made caution feel like cowardice. The agency waiting room was full of girls who looked exactly like you. Tall, young, slightly unsure of where to put their hands. Nobody mentioned that this was the first filter, that half the girls in that waiting room would be told their look was not quite right after all, that the look, it turned out, was a moving target. The recruitment pipeline for models in the 1980s was not regulated in any meaningful way. There were no standardized protections for minors, no required disclosure of what the industry actually involved, no cooling-off period between the scout handing you a card and you signing a contract that would govern your professional life for years. Agencies held open calls in cities across the country. They ran competitions in fashion magazines that promised the winner a contract and a trip to New York. They partnered with photographers who would take your first test shots in exchange for your trust and your time, and occasionally other things that were not part of any written agreement. The girls who came from smaller cities were the most vulnerable, and the industry knew it. They arrived with the most to prove, the most to lose, and the least institutional knowledge about how any of this worked. They didn't have friends who had done this before. They did not have agents of their own to review the contracts. They had enthusiasm and good bone structure and a profound, understandable hunger to become something larger than the geography they came from. And here is the part that the recruitment pitch never included. The fashion industry in the 1980s had a surplus of girls who got off the bus. It did not need to protect any individual one of them because there was always another bus coming from another small city, carrying another girl with a look, eating another pretzel, being handed another card by another stranger who seemed, in that particular fluorescent lit moment, like someone who could change everything. Most of them went home eventually. Some of them stayed. All of them were changed. And the machine, indifferent and efficient, kept running, kept scouting, kept handing out cards to girls who did not yet know what they were agreeing to. It had been doing it for decades. It had many more decades to go. The contract was usually several pages long, printed in a font designed to make your eyes glaze over, and presented to you by someone whose job was to seem friendly, while also ensuring that every clause favoured the agency in perpetuity. In the 1980s, modelling contracts were notoriously one-sided documents that gave agencies staggering control over where a model worked, how she presented herself, who she could work with, and in some cases, what she was allowed to eat on a job, and you signed them. Of course you signed them. You were 17, you were excited, and the woman across the desk was wearing Chanel and had the kind of effortless confidence that made everything she said feel like wisdom rather than a legal trap. The standard agency commission in the 1980s sat at around 15 to 20% of your gross earnings. This was the number that was mentioned. What was mentioned less prominently was the list of additional fees that accumulated beneath that headline figure like footnotes to a document you had not been given enough time to read. Administrative fees, messenger fees, the cost of printing your composite cards, which was charged back to you at a rate that seemed reasonable until you received your first statement and did some quiet, alarming arithmetic at your kitchen table. The exclusivity clauses were where things got particularly interesting. And by interesting, I mean one-sided in a way that would have impressed a medieval feudal lord. Many contracts required models to work exclusively through the signing agency, meaning that if a client approached you directly, or if another agency expressed interest, or if you wanted to explore any professional opportunity that did not route back through the people who owned your contract, you were in breach. In practice, this meant that the agency sat between you and every dollar you earned, and if the agency decided, for whatever reason, that a particular job was not worth pursuing on your behalf, the decision was theirs to make and yours to live with. There was also, in many contracts, a clause governing your appearance, not a vague aspiration about looking professional, a specific written requirement to maintain the measurements recorded at signing with the implicit understanding that deviating from those measurements constituted a failure to deliver the product the agency had contracted to provide. The product being you, your body, measured, documented, and made contractually binding on a Tuesday afternoon while you smiled across a desk at a woman in Chanel. Lawyers were not part of the process, not because models could not have brought one, but because the suggestion of bringing one would have read as difficult, and difficult was not a quality that got you placed at the top of the booking pile. The power differential was so complete, so normalized, and so deeply embedded in the culture of the industry that most models simply did not think to question it. You trusted the agency because the agency was the door, and questioning the door was a good way to find yourself standing permanently outside it. What made the contracts of the 1980s particularly consequential was that they were not anomalies. They were the standard. They were the industry operating exactly as it had been designed to operate, efficiently extracting the maximum value from the maximum number of women in the minimum amount of time, with the minimum amount of legal inconvenience. The women who signed them were not naive. They were simply operating in a system that had been constructed long before they arrived and that would continue long after they left. They signed. The agency smiled. And the clock, already running, ran a little faster. Before the internet, before digital portfolios, before anyone could Google you, there was the composite card. A small printed card featuring your face on one side, a few test shots on the other, and at the very bottom, in cold black type, your statistics: height, weight, bust, waist, hips, dress size, hair colour, eye colour, shoe size. That was you. That was the entire professional summation of a living, breathing human being with thoughts and dreams and a complicated relationship with her mother. Agents handed these out by the stack, bookers flipped through them like baseball cards, and clients selected models the way you might select a throw pillow, quickly, without guilt, and based entirely on whether you matched the sofa. The photographs on the composite card were called your test shots, and getting them right was its own exhausting, expensive project. You needed to show range, the agency said, which meant at minimum a clean headshot, a three-quarter body shot, and at least one image that demonstrated you could convey a mood other than standing there. You paid for these tests, or rather, they were charged back to you by the agency, who arranged them with photographers who were sometimes talented, emerging professionals, and sometimes men who had found an efficient way to spend time with attractive young women while calling it work. You smiled, you posed, you trusted the result because you had no other option. The measurements at the bottom of the card were the part that made the whole enterprise feel most like a livestock auction, and I say that not to be unkind, but because several former models of the era have used precisely that comparison when describing how it felt to have your hip measurement printed on a card and distributed to strangers. The standard measurements for a working model in the 1980s were a 34-inch bust, a 23 or 24-inch waist, and a 34-inch hip. These were not health guidelines. They were not based on any scientific assessment of the female form. They were the dimensions of the sample garments that designers made for the runway, and since the model existed primarily to wear the sample, the model was expected to fit the sample rather than the other way around. What happened when the measurements drifted was a matter of agency culture, but the kindest version involved a gentle, private conversation with your booker in which the word concerned appeared more than once. The less kind version involved your name quietly moving down the list until the message became clear without anyone having to say it out loud. The composite card was updated periodically, which meant that if your measurements changed, the card changed, which meant that every client who had your old card now had documentation of the change, which meant that the drift, whatever it was now part of your professional record in a way that was impossible to uncircumstance. Some models kept their old composite cards. Years later, reading the measurements printed at the bottom, many of them said the same thing, that the numbers had belonged to a version of their body that they had maintained at a cost they did not fully calculate until long after the cards had stopped being useful. A 23-inch waist on a 5'10" woman is, by most clinical assessments, quite small. At the time, in the context of the industry, it was simply the number. Matter of fact, professional. printed in clean black type at the bottom of a 4x6 card that someone was flipping through right now somewhere, deciding whether you were worth a phone call. You were more than the card. You knew that. But the card was what they saw first, and in an industry built on first impressions delivered at the speed of a flipped page, the card was often the only impression they needed. 4 by 6 inches. Everything you were, professionally speaking, distilled to a set of numbers and 3 photographs. At least the font was clean. The casting call was held in a room that was somehow both enormous and suffocating at the same time. You arrived at the address on your go-see sheet, took the elevator to a floor that smelled like hairspray and low-grade anxiety, and walked into a waiting area where somewhere between 40 and 100 other women were already sitting, standing or leaning against walls, all of them also tall, also beautiful, and all of them pretending not to look at each other while absolutely looking at each other. There were folding chairs, there was a clipboard, there was a man or a woman behind a desk who would glance up at you for approximately 3 seconds, ask you to turn around, and then write something down that you would never be allowed to read. You signed in, and you waited. The waiting was its own form of psychological weather. You sat with your portfolio on your lap, which was a large black book containing your best photographs, the ones your agency had selected because they showed your range and your bone structure, and the specific quality of whatever it was your booker believed you were selling that season. The portfolio was your evidence. Evidence that you had done this before, that other people had found you valuable, that you were not simply a tall woman in a waiting room but a professional with a documented history of being chosen. The casting director, when they finally saw you, did not look at the portfolio first. They looked at you. This took a few seconds and felt like considerably longer. They looked at your face, at your body, at the way you were standing, and they made a preliminary assessment that was entirely subjective and entirely determinative of how the next 30 seconds would proceed. Then they looked at your book. They flipped through it with the speed of someone who had been doing this for hours, because they had been doing this for hours, and the photographs you had spent weeks and several $100s curating were reviewed in approximately the same time it takes to read a takeout menu. Turn around, they said. You turned around. Walk to the end of the room and back, some of them said. You walked. You had practiced the walk, of course, because walking sounds simple and is not, or rather it is simple. But the specific walk required by the fashion industry is a performance of effortlessness that requires considerable effort, which is the central irony of nearly everything in this world. Head up, shoulders back, hips forward. The walk that said, I am completely comfortable being looked at by everyone in this room, which you are not, but the performance of comfort was the job. Then it was over. Thank you, they said, and the thank you meant nothing specific and everything practical, and you gathered your portfolio and walked back out into the hallway where the next woman was already waiting, and you pressed the button for the elevator, and somewhere in the room you had just left, someone was writing something on a sheet of paper about your hips or your walk or the angle of your jaw, and you would never know what they had written because the feedback loop in the casting process ran entirely in one direction. You might hear back within the day. You might hear back within the week. You might never hear back at all, which was its own answer, delivered in the specific silence of an industry that did not feel obligated to close the loop with the women it had asked to come in. There were women who went to 10 castings in a week and booked nothing. There were women who went to 1 casting and booked a campaign that ran for 2 years. The system was not merit-based in any legible way. It was taste-based, mood-based, who walked in at the right moment based. You came back. You signed the clipboard again. You sat in the folding chair. You waited. Because the alternative was not coming back, and not coming back meant the answer was already no. Your booker was the person who called you with jobs, managed your schedule, negotiated your rates, and also, without any apparent awareness of the contradiction, told you with genuine warmth that you needed to lose 5 pounds before the Valentino booking. They were often brilliant, often charming, occasionally ferociously loyal, and almost always operating in a system that required them to treat you like a product first and a person somewhere considerably further down the list. A good booker in the 1980s could make a career. A bad one, or simply an indifferent one, could quietly allow a career to collapse through neglect, poor choices, or the simple act of sending your composite card to the bottom of the pile. The relationship between a model and her booker was one of the more psychologically complex arrangements in an industry full of psychologically complex arrangements. You needed the booker needed you to be bookable. These were not the same need, and the gap between them was where most of the trouble lived. Your booker knew your measurements, your rates, your booking history, your client relationships, and in many cases the state of your romantic life and your eating habits, because all of these things were considered relevant professional information in an industry that had decided the personal and the professional were the same thing when the personal thing had a body. Bookers communicated in a specific language that took a while to learn. Praise was rarely unconditional. There was almost always a "but" or a "when you've" or a "once we get" appended to the compliment like a small cold wind following a warm one. "You have such a great look." "Once we lean you out a bit before Paris, you'll be unstoppable." Or, "That Vogue shoot was gorgeous. They loved you." The client for the other job went a different direction, but were keeping you top of mind. The translation of keeping you top of mind was that you had not been booked, but the booker did not want you to go to another agency, and the translation of went a different direction was that someone thinner or younger or less expensive had taken the job, and the translation of lean you out a bit was what it was. The booker also served as a buffer between the model and the clients, which meant that bad news was delivered through a layer of managed language, and good news arrived with the specific brightness of someone who wanted credit for having secured it. When a client cancelled a booking the day before, the booker was sympathetic. When a rate was negotiated down without your knowledge, the booker explained that the market was soft. When a photographer asked for something that made you uncomfortable, the booker sometimes handled it and sometimes suggested that you were perhaps being sensitive and that this particular photographer was very important and it would be worth maintaining the relationship. What made the booker relationship so complicated was that the care within it was often genuine. Many bookers genuinely liked the women they represented. They followed their careers with real investment, celebrated their successes, and were sometimes the only person in the industry who learned your name before your measurements. But the structure of the business meant that even the most caring booker was ultimately managing an asset. And asset management, however warmly conducted, is not the same as advocacy. The booker worked for the agency worked for the clients, you worked for all of them, and somewhere in that chain, the question of who was working for you got a little difficult to answer. There was always something. Always. If it was not your hips, it was your arms. If it was not your arms, it was the way your stomach looked in a certain silhouette, or the fact that your collarbone was not quite prominent enough, or that you carried weight differently than the sample, and could you perhaps do something about that before Thursday? In the 1980s, the fashion industry operated with the casual institutional certainty that a woman's body was a project under permanent renovation, and that the polite professional thing to do was to notice deficiencies early, and often so that she had plenty of time to address them before the season began. This was not considered cruelty. It was considered feedback. The body commentary was delivered in a variety of registers, and learning to identify each one was a survival skill that took time to develop. There was the direct version, which was rect, the kindest in the sense that it was at least legible. Your booker or a client or a designer's assistant told you plainly that a particular measurement needed to change, and the expectation was clear, and however unpleasant the clarity was, it left no room for confusion. Then there was the indirect version, which operated through suggestion and silence, and the specific way someone's eyes moved across your body during a fitting, pausing briefly somewhere before they moved on and said something about the hem. The indirect version was worse because it was everywhere and nowhere and impossible to address directly without sounding paranoid. Then there was the comparative version, which was perhaps the most insidious. This was the comment delivered in reference to someone else, someone whose body was held up as the implicit standard against which yours was being quietly measured. She's looking incredible lately. Did you see her at the Armani show? A pause. She's been really disciplined. The sentence did not need to finish. You finished it yourself, internally, in the specific way that the industry had trained you to internalize criticism, delivered at a conversational angle, so that it arrived without a sender and could not be argued with. The bodies that the 1980s fashion industry favoured were tall, narrow and long-limbed, with the kind of angular structure that reads well in a photograph and exists naturally in a fairly small percentage of the human population. Many of the women who built careers in the industry had these proportions naturally. Many others had them naturally at the beginning of their careers and maintained them at a cost as their bodies matured and the natural proportions shifted in the direction of adulthood. The industry's response to this shift was consistent. The proportions were preferred to the adulthood, and the woman was expected to manage the gap. What this meant in practice was a daily negotiation between a body's needs and an industry's preferences, conducted privately and at significant personal cost in ways that the industry did not track, did not acknowledge, and did not consider its responsibility to mitigate. You ate carefully. You exercised in ways that were less about health and more about maintaining specific visible dimensions. You stood in fittings while your body was discussed by people who were not looking at you as a person, but as a surface, and you kept your face neutral because neutrality was professional, and professional was the only identity the room was equipped to receive. The remarkable thing, looking back, is how completely ordinary all of this felt to the women inside it. Not because it was not damaging, but because it was so consistent and so widespread and so thoroughly normalized that the alternative, an industry that simply dressed the bodies it had rather than correcting the bodies it received, was not imaginable from inside it. Your body was a professional matter. Its dimensions were professionally maintained. And if maintaining them cost you something, the cost was private, personal, and yours alone to carry quietly. Lunch was a complicated subject, not because the food was bad, though it often was, but because eating it at all required a kind of quiet defiance that not everyone had the energy for. In an industry that communicated its expectations through sample sizes and offhand comments, and the simple, devastating act of booking the girl next to you instead of you, hunger became normalized in a way that nobody talked about directly but everybody understood. You learned to read the signals. You learned that a casting director complimenting your cheekbones was often a coded reference to the fact that the rest of your face had thinned out nicely. You learned that certain things you did not eat, and that this was not a choice so much as a professional requirement nobody had ever bothered to write down. The model apartment in the 1980s typically contained a refrigerator that was either empty or filled with items that told a story of careful management. Diet sodas, black coffee, the occasional piece of fruit bought with the specific intention of photographing it more than eating it. Meals on set were another study. Craft services existed, tables of food available between shots, sandwiches and pastries, and all the carbohydrates that the industry simultaneously provided and implicitly discouraged. Some women ate from these tables freely and without apparent consequence. Others ate nothing and observed the ones who did with an attention that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with arithmetic. The culture around food in the industry operated on a logic that seemed coherent from inside it and somewhat bewildering from outside. On one hand, models were working long physical days, early call times, multiple fittings, hours of standing in shoes that damaged their feet, runway rehearsals, go-sees across entire cities. The caloric requirements of this workload were not small. On the other hand, the aesthetic requirements of the job demanded that the body remain within a very narrow range of dimensions, and those dimensions were in many cases incompatible with eating enough to comfortably support the actual physical demands of the work. The gap between what the body needed and what the industry required was bridged primarily by the women themselves, silently, privately, at personal cost. What the 1980s fashion industry did not have was any institutional framework for identifying or addressing disordered eating. The term eating disorder was not part of industry vocabulary in the way it would become in subsequent decades. What was visible was thinness, and thinness was interpreted not as a symptom, but as a professional credential. A woman who was clearly under-eating was not a woman in distress. She was a woman who was committed, disciplined, serious about her career. The language of willpower wrapped the reality of deprivation in a vocabulary of admiration that made it very difficult to ask for help, because asking for help would have required naming the thing, and naming the thing would have required the industry to look at what it was doing, and the industry was not ready to do that. Some women found equilibrium, some found it immediately, and some found it years later in therapists' offices, and some found it by leaving the industry altogether and reclaiming their relationship with food in the absence of the professional pressure that had distorted it. Some never fully found it. The physical consequences of years of insufficient nutrition are real and lasting in ways that do not resolve when the bookings stop. Bone density, hormonal disruption, cardiovascular health. The body keeps a record of what it was not given, and it presents that record eventually in the quiet of a life lived after the cameras. You are hungry. This is the simple sentence that industry's aestheticized language never quite got to. You are hungry, and you are young, and you were told in 100 indirect ways that the hunger was the point. On a slow day, you might have 4 go-sees. On a busy day, you might have 10. A go-see was exactly what it sounded like. You went, they saw you, and then usually nothing happened. You took the subway, or if you were new and still believed the industry owed you something, you took a cab and you arrived at an address that was sometimes a studio and sometimes a showroom, and sometimes what appeared to be a storage facility with opinions about hemlines. You showed your book, you turned around when asked, you answered questions like, where are you from and how long have you been in the city, and then you left and went to the next one, all day, in heels, across multiple boroughs, in weather that did not care about your blowout. The go-see sheet was a daily document produced by your agency that listed the addresses, times, and names of the clients you were expected to visit that day. It was delivered in the morning, sometimes with enough lead time to plan your route efficiently, and sometimes with the apparent assumption that you had a helicopter and a working knowledge of New York traffic patterns. The addresses were distributed across the city with a geographical randomness that suggested the person who compiled the list had never personally travelled between a showroom in Soho and a photographer's studio in the far West 50s in 45 minutes on foot, while carrying a portfolio and wearing shoes that were one size too small because your agency said they photographed better. You were expected to look perfect at every go-see. This was not a suggestion. You arrived at each appointment as though you had been doing nothing more taxing than sitting in a salon all morning, hair intact, makeup fresh, posture excellent, feet not visibly screaming inside shoes that were technically your size and practically an act of aggression. The performance of effortlessness was required all day, every day, across every borough, in every season, regardless of whether you had slept properly or eaten adequately, or received a discouraging rejection 45 minutes earlier at the previous address. The go-see system was also financially invisible. You were not paid to attend go-sees. They were considered part of the job of being available to the job, which was a philosophical distinction that made sense from the agency's perspective, and was considerably less satisfying from yours when you calculated the cost of transportation, the depreciation on your portfolio, and the productive hours consumed by a day of appointments that resulted in nothing bookable. Some weeks the go-sees led to work, many weeks they did not. The ratio between effort expended and income generated was not one that would have survived scrutiny in most other professional contexts, but in the fashion industry it was simply the cost of staying visible, and staying visible was the cost of staying in the game. There was also a social performance embedded in the go-see that deserves acknowledgement. You were expected to be warm, engaging, and memorable, without being so memorable that you became difficult. You were supposed to stand out from the 40 other women the client had seen that day, while also being entirely capable of adapting to whatever aesthetic they had in mind. You were supposed to be distinctive and flexible simultaneously, which is roughly equivalent to being asked to be a signature and a blank page at the same time. You managed this by being excellent at the specific kind of social performance that the industry rewarded: present, pleasant, unhurried, and professionally devoid of needs. By the end of a 10-go-see day, your feet were damaged, your composure was architectural, and your portfolio had been handled by enough strangers that it needed new plastic sleeves. You went home, or back to the apartment, and you looked at tomorrow's go-see sheet, and you noted where it was, and how far it was from the previous appointment, and you set your alarm and decided which shoes were least likely to cause permanent structural damage, and you went to sleep, and then you did it again. The first thing most agencies did when you walked in was take Polaroids. Not glamorous photographs, not the kind of images that ended up anywhere, just raw, unretouched, unflattering instant photographs taken under fluorescent light, while you stood against a white wall in your own clothes, usually right after a train ride, usually slightly sweaty, always slightly terrified. These were called your digitals, or your Polaroids, or simply your naturals, and their purpose was to show clients what you looked like without the benefit of a makeup artist or a photographer who knew how to use light. Which is to say, they were designed to show clients the version of you that the industry considered the truest version, the version before the artifice, stripped of every tool you might have used to feel like yourself. The Polaroid camera produced its image in approximately 60 seconds, which was about 55 seconds longer than it took for you to realise this photograph was not going to be your best work. The fluorescent light in agency offices in the 1980s was not selected for its flattering qualities. It was selected because it was cheap and bright and available, and it illuminated every pore and asymmetry and shadow with the clinical thoroughness of a medical examination. You stood against the white wall, you held your hair back when asked, you turned to the side when asked, and the camera clicked, and the photograph emerged from the bottom of the device and developed slowly in someone else's hand, while you stood there having the peculiar experience of watching your appearance become evidence. The Polaroids were sent to clients by messenger, or kept in the agency's files, or sometimes pinned to boards in the agency's offices alongside the Polaroids of every other woman they represented, creating a visual catalogue of faces and bodies that clients could browse when they were deciding whom to call in for a casting. The women on the board did not know exactly when they were being looked at or in what context or alongside whom. Your image existed in the agency's physical space as a standing document of your current appearance, available for consultation at any moment, subject to the ongoing informal assessment of anyone who walked through the office. The Polaroid was also used as a before and after document, though nobody called it that. If your appearance changed between seasons, the new Polaroid was compared implicitly or explicitly to the old one. If you had lost weight, this was noted favourably or neutrally. If you had gained weight, this was noted less favourably, and the nature of the noting ranged from a conversation to a quiet repositioning of your Polaroid on the board that you might not immediately notice but would eventually feel in the number of calls you were or were not receiving. There is something philosophically strange about the Polaroid as an industry instrument, which is that it was designed to capture the unguarded, unprepared version of you, and then use that version to determine your professional value. Most industries allow their workers to prepare for professional assessment. They allow for the performance of competence. The fashion industry's insistence on the natural photograph, taken before you had done your hair or applied your makeup or composed yourself into the professional self you had carefully constructed, was a way of asserting that your natural state was the product being sold, and the product's quality was subject to inspection without notice. You could be looked at any time. You were always already being assessed. There was no moment in the professional day when the evaluation stopped. Standing against the white wall, you smiled or you did not smile, and the camera clicked. And 60 seconds later, there you were, slightly tired, slightly exposed, lit by fluorescent light, translated into a small square photograph that someone was about to put in a file with your name on it and use to decide what you were worth. The photographer had the final say on how you looked. Not you, not your agency, not your own mirror. The person behind the lens decided whether you were luminous or flat, whether you had presence or disappeared into the background, whether the image they sent to the client would book you the job or quietly ensure you never worked with that client again. In the 1980s, photographers held extraordinary power in the fashion world, and while many of them were talented professionals who treated the women they worked with respectfully, the structure of the industry meant that the ones who did not had very few checks on their behaviour, and a great many, women in a vulnerable position who needed the booking. The major photographers of the era were not simply technicians, they were cultural figures, with names that clients recognised and requested and paid premium rates to access. A strong relationship with the right photographer could define a model's career. Richard Avedon, Helmut Newton, Irving Penn, Arthur Elgort. To be chosen by one of these men to appear in their work was to have your professional credibility confirmed by a source that the industry considered authoritative. The reverse was also true. To be known as difficult with a photographer, or to have a session go poorly, or to be dropped from a project that a prominent photographer was attached to sent a signal through the industry's informal communication network that arrived before any formal announcement. The dynamic on set was not one between equals. The photographer was the creative authority employed by the client in a space they controlled with a team who worked for them or alongside them in a professional context that predated and would outlast your presence in it. You were the subject. You had skills, certainly, the ability to convey emotion through controlled physical expression, to hold a position for extended periods, to adjust your body in response to direction without breaking the visual continuity of the frame. These were real and learned skills. They were also skills whose value was entirely contingent on whether the person behind the camera chose to use them. Some photographers worked collaboratively, building the image through conversation and iteration, treating the model as an active participant in the creative process rather than a surface to be arranged. Others worked differently, directive, exacting, communicating through correction rather than dialogue, treating the session as a solo project in which you were a necessary but essentially passive element. Both approaches could produce excellent images. The difference was what the experience cost you personally, and since the personal cost was not visible in the final photograph, it was not generally considered relevant to the professional assessment of the photographer's work. The test shoot arrangement deserves particular mention. New models were frequently offered test shoots by photographers who wanted to build their portfolios, or who claimed to want to build their portfolios, in exchange for the model's time and presence and trust. These sessions were not paid. They were framed as mutual benefit. The photographer got images, the model got photographs for her book. The arrangement was legitimate when it was legitimate, and it was also, structurally, an arrangement in which a young woman with no professional protection spent hours alone with a man who had explicitly requested her presence and implicitly held the power to determine whether the resulting images helped or harmed her career. The industry treated this as standard practice. It was standard practice. These two facts existed simultaneously without apparent irony for the entire decade. You showed up, you worked. The photographer directed and you followed the direction because that was the job, and because the photographs were the currency, and because the building you were standing in belonged to someone else, and the relationship you needed to preserve was the relationship with the person behind the camera. You were professional. You were present. You made the image they needed. And then you picked up your bag and your portfolio, and you went back out into the city and onto the subway and toward the next go-see, and the photographs existed now in someone else's possession, and what they did with them was largely their decision. The fitting was not a creative experience. It was a measurement experience. You arrived at the designer's showroom or studio. You were handed a garment that had been made for a body that may or may not have resembled yours, and you put it on. If it fit, the room relaxed. If it did not fit, the room did not relax. Assistants pinned fabric with a speed and confidence that suggested they had done this many times before without caring much about the comfort of the person inside the garment, which they had. Designers walked around you slowly. They tugged at things. They spoke about you in the third person while you were standing directly in front of them. She needs to take in the waist. The shoulders are pulling. Something will need to be done about the hips before Saturday. The sample garment was the fixed point around which everything else rotated. It had been constructed in a specific size by pattern makers working to measurements established by the designer, and it represented the vision of how the clothes were supposed to look on the runway. The model's job was to be the body that made that vision legible. If the vision required a 34-inch hip and your hip was 35 inches, the vision was not wrong. Your hip was wrong. This was the operating logic of the fitting room, and it was applied with a consistency that suggested nobody had ever stopped to question it. The physical experience of a fitting was uncomfortable in ways that accumulated over the course of an hour. You stood on a small platform or on the floor, and you held your arms in positions that the garment required rather than positions your body preferred, and you did not shift your weight or reach for water or check the time because movement disrupted the drape, and the drape was what was being assessed. Pins were inserted into fabric that was in direct contact with your skin, and occasionally they were inserted into your skin as well, and the appropriate response to this was a slight inward breath, rather than the more instinctive response, which was to say something about it. The fitting room conversation was its own genre of professional communication. Designers spoke in shorthand to their teams, and the shorthand was about fabric and construction and line and proportion, and sometimes it was about you, and the distinction between talking about the dress and talking about your body became, in the fitting room context, essentially academic. If the dress was too tight across the back was the problem. If the waist was gaping, your waist was the problem. The grammar of the fitting room constructed you as the variable in an equation, where the garment was the constant, and since you were the variable, you were the thing that needed adjustment. Some designers were warmer than others, some looked at you directly and said please and thank you, and acknowledged that you were a person standing in their studio rather than a mannequin that happened to require occasionally feeding. These were the fittings you looked forward to, and they were not the majority. The majority were efficient, impersonal, and completed with the brisk energy of people who had 12 more fittings scheduled before the end of the day, and no particular reason to slow down. What the fitting room produced, beyond the adjusted garment, was a very particular kind of bodily self-consciousness. You became aware of your body not as something that belonged to you and carried you through the world, but as something external and accessible, a surface that other people had professional opinions about and professional authority to comment on. You carried that awareness out of the fitting room and into the rest of your day. It was not heavy exactly. It was more like a low, persistent hum that ran underneath everything else you did. The feeling that you were always slightly on display. That your body was always slightly someone else's concern. The runway show lasted approximately 12 minutes. Your individual walk lasted approximately 70 seconds. The preparation lasted hours. You arrived at the venue in the early morning. You sat in a chair while your hair and makeup were done by people who were working on 4 other women simultaneously, and who occasionally stabbed you with a bobby pin without apology. And then you stood in a holding area with 30 other models in various states of undress, waiting for the signal to go. The clothes were extraordinary. The shoes were, more often than not, instruments of genuine suffering. And when your name was called and you stepped through the curtain into the light and the noise and the cameras, you had exactly 70 seconds to make it look effortless. The backstage area of a major fashion show in the 1980s was a specific kind of organised chaos that has never been adequately described by anyone who has not stood inside it. It was loud and bright and crowded with bodies and garment bags and rolling racks and people with clipboards and people without clipboards, who were somehow more important than the people with clipboards. Hairstylists moved between models with the focused urgency of surgical teams. Makeup artists carried palettes the size of small suitcases. Dressers, the people responsible for getting you in and out of the garment in the 30-second window between your exit from the runway and your next entrance onto it, stood ready with the look of people who had done this under worse conditions and were prepared for anything. The clothes themselves were works of considerable artistry. In the 1980s, the major European houses were producing runway collections of genuine ambition. Yves Saint Laurent's power suits, Versace's bodycon silhouettes, Claude Montana's architectural shoulders, Thierry Mugler's sculptural constructions. To wear these clothes was to participate in something that genuinely mattered to fashion history, and most of the models understood this even in the middle of all the chaos, even while standing in shoes that had been designed for the visual effect they created, rather than the structural support they provided, which was none. The shoes deserve their own sentence because the shoes were a recurring feature of model testimony about runway work that crosses decades with remarkable consistency. Heels in the 1980s runway context were frequently 4 inches or higher, sometimes on platforms that added additional instability, sometimes on soles so thin that the sensation of walking on them was somewhere between challenging and genuinely precarious. You were expected to walk on these shoes with confidence, grace, and the specific forward momentum of someone who found the whole thing entirely natural, on a runway that was often slippery, in a venue that had been converted from an industrial space that was not designed for heel traffic. Ankle injuries were not uncommon. What was uncommon was anyone expressing significant concern about this. The walk itself was its own athletic achievement. The runway walk of the 1980s had a particular quality, purposeful, slightly confrontational, with a hip movement that was less about sexual display and more about the physics of moving a structured garment through space in a way that showed its construction to best advantage. You practiced it. You had been practicing it since you arrived at the agency. Some women had it naturally and some women developed it, and some women never quite found it. And that was the end of their runway career, stated in those terms, without further comment. And then it was over. You walked back through the curtain, the dresser was already moving, the next garment was already waiting, and somewhere behind you the audience was still responding to the entrance you had just made, with your face composed and your spine straight and 70 seconds of apparent effortlessness that had cost you considerably more than that to produce. They sat in the front row with their programs and their sunglasses and their expressions of studied neutrality, and they were the most important people in the room. Fashion editors, magazine directors, major buyers, critics whose column inches, could make a designer's season or quietly dismantle it. And somewhere in their peripheral attention, incidentally, was you, the woman walking past them in someone else's clothes, hoping to be noticed in exactly the right way and not noticed in any of the wrong ones. In the 1980s, these were overwhelmingly powerful gatekeepers in an industry that had very little appetite for the opinions of the women who actually wore the clothes or the women who actually modelled them. The front row of a major fashion show in the 1980s was its own ecosystem, governed by a social hierarchy so refined and so thoroughly understood by its participants that it required no explanation and tolerated no transgression. Who sat where was not an accident. The placement of seats communicated the relative importance of the people occupying them with a precision that any diplomat would have recognized and appreciated. The front row proper was reserved for the most significant editors and buyers, the people whose presence at your show validated it, whose absence would be noted in the coverage as a meaningful omission. Anna Wintour, who became editor-in-chief of American Vogue in 1988, represented the apex of this power in its most concentrated form. A single positive mention in Vogue could transform a model's booking rate. A photograph in a Vogue editorial, shot by the right photographer and styled by the right team, was worth more to a model's career than a year of catalogue work, and the gap between those two things in terms of income was significant enough that most models would have traded the income for the exposure without much deliberation. The editors knew this. The power it gave them was not incidental to their positions, it was the position. Fashion critics operated with a different kind of influence, one that was more verbal than visual, and therefore slightly less immediately legible in its consequences, but no less real in its effects. Critical review that praised a designer's collection and mentioned specific models by name as particularly effective was the kind of professional endorsement that could not be purchased and could not be manufactured. It arrived from outside the industry's own promotional apparatus and therefore carried a credibility that internal praise could not replicate. The reverse was equally true. A review that described a runway presentation as chaotic or uninspiring, or that mentioned that the casting had been misjudged, sent a signal to every booker and client reading it that something had not worked. And the something was sometimes the clothes and sometimes the models and sometimes genuinely impossible to distinguish between the two. What the women walking the runway experienced from the front row was attention that was simultaneously total and impersonal. You were looked at with complete focus by people who were professional lookers, whose entire careers were built on the quality of their visual assessment, and the looking was not about you. It was about the clothes you were wearing and the way the clothes moved and the silhouette they created, and whether the designer's vision was communicating effectively. You were the medium. The front row was reading the message. The distinction between the message and the medium was, in that room, the distinction between the people sitting and the people walking, and it was absolute. You walked past them with your chin level and your gaze forward and your 70 seconds of runway time exactly as prepared and exactly as professional as you could make it, and then you were past them, and the next model was already coming through the curtain, and somewhere in the front row someone was writing something in a program or leaning to say something to the person beside them, and the season was being decided quietly by people you could not see anymore, because you were already backstage being unpinned from one extraordinary garment and pinned into another. Paris was the goal. It was always the goal. Your booker mentioned it with a reverence usually reserved for religious destinations, and the models who had been there came back with a particular quality, something polished and slightly unreadable, as though they had learned something important that they were not entirely sure they wanted to have learned. The Paris collections were the pinnacle. Yves Saint Laurent, Chanel, Christian Dior, Givenchy, names that sounded like promises. What nobody mentioned with equal enthusiasm was the reality of being a young American woman, alone, in a city where she did not speak the language, placed in an agency-provided apartment with 3 other models, subsisting on a daily allowance that barely covered the metro, and expected to project the effortless ease of someone who had never been afraid of anything. The Paris fashion season happened twice a year, in January for the haute couture presentations and in October for the ready-to-wear collections, and the concentration of major shows into a compressed period of roughly 2 weeks meant that the city was simultaneously the most exciting and the most brutal professional environment a model could find herself in. Every major house was casting simultaneously. Every agency was trying to place its girls in the most prestigious slots. Every model who had made it to Paris was competing with every other model who had made it to Paris, in a city that was beautiful and indifferent, and had been doing this long before any of them arrived, and would continue long after they left. The French agencies that received American models on transfer were a new institutional relationship to navigate on top of all the others. They had their own culture, their own communication style, their own hierarchy of clients, and their own opinions about the specific qualities that made a model viable in the European market as opposed to the American one. European fashion in the 1980s favoured a particular aesthetic, less of the wholesome accessibility associated with American catalogue work, and more of the cool, slightly remote quality that photographers like Helmut Newton and Helmut Lang were using to define the visual language of the decade. If you arrived from New York with the wrong energy, whatever that meant, it was communicated to you through the specific blankness with which your first Paris casting was received. The financial structure of working in Paris added another layer of complexity to the experience. The model apartment was charged to your account. Transportation to and from castings was your responsibility. The daily allowance provided by the agency was calculated to cover basic survival and not much beyond it, which in Paris in the 1980s meant that basic survival was achievable, but that the cafes and restaurants and patisseries that surrounded you on every street were, for practical purposes, decorative. You were living in one of the world's great food cities on a budget that made eating in it a careful, calculated exercise. And the loneliness deserves acknowledgement because it was real, and it was common, and it was almost never discussed, because discussing it would have seemed ungrateful, and weakness was not a quality the industry rewarded. You were 19, or 20, or 22, in a foreign city, surrounded by women who were also pretending they were fine, spending your days being assessed and rejected and occasionally selected, eating carefully, sleeping in a shared apartment, calling home on a phone that charged by the minute, and presenting, at every casting and every go-see and every show call, the face of someone who found all of this completely natural. Paris was the dream. It was also, frequently, the hardest thing you had ever done. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the industry only had room to acknowledge one of them. The model apartment was a concept that sounded reasonable in theory and was uncomfortable in practice. Agencies often arranged housing for their models, particularly the newer ones, in apartments that were shared by multiple women, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, and occasionally more than that if the agency was having a particularly optimistic month. These apartments were functional. They were located near the agency. They were charged back to the models at rates that seemed reasonable until you did the math and realised that between the apartment, the composite cards, the messenger fees, and the assorted administrative costs that appeared on your statement like uninvited guests at a dinner party, you were regularly in debt to the people whose job it was to make you money. The apartments themselves varied in quality in ways that correlated imperfectly with the prestige of the agency housing you in them. Some were genuinely comfortable, well located, adequately furnished, large enough that 4 women sharing a bathroom felt like a manageable inconvenience rather than a daily logistical negotiation. Others were the kind of apartments that the word functional described with maximum generosity: narrow, dim, furnished with items that had been acquired for durability rather than comfort, in buildings where the elevator reliability was a matter of daily suspense. In both cases, the rent charge back to the models reflected the agency's assessment of the accommodation's market value rather than the model's experience of living in it. The social dynamics of the model apartment were their own study in compressed human interaction. You were sharing intimate daily space with women you had not chosen, who were also your professional competition, who were at various stages of their careers and various states of emotional equilibrium, and who shared your bathroom and your kitchen and your morning routine in a proximity that accelerated the development of either genuine friendship or genuine friction with roughly equal frequency. Some of the women you lived with in model apartments became the closest friends of your life, the people who understood the specific texture of that experience because they had lived it alongside you. Others you outlasted in silent mutual relief. The bathroom schedule was a recurring logistical challenge that nobody who has not shared a single bathroom with 3 other women, all of whom have early call times and professional obligations attached to their appearance, can fully appreciate. The morning routine in a model apartment was a military operation conducted under the pressure of multiple go-see sheets and the mutual, unspoken understanding that everyone needed to be out the door by 8 and everyone needed to look impeccable. And there was 1 mirror and 1 hairdryer, and the hot water ran out after the second shower. Alliances were formed around bathroom scheduling. Resentments developed over the hairdryer. These were not small things. These were the actual texture of daily life. What the agency framed as a convenience and a benefit, housing arranged, location central, other models nearby for company, was also a mechanism of continued financial dependence that extended the period during which the model owed the agency money before she had the professional stability to make other arrangements. The apartment debt accumulated alongside the composite card debt and the messenger fee debt and the various administrative charges, and the total was presented periodically on a statement that could be alarming in its size relative to your current earnings. You were not trapped exactly. You could leave. But leaving required having somewhere else to go and the financial cushion to get there, and the structure of the apartment arrangement was not designed to help you accumulate that cushion quickly. You shared the space, you navigated the schedule, you lived in the apartment and went to the go-sees and came back and compared notes with the women you had not chosen but had been given. And some nights someone ordered food and everyone ate together and it was fine, genuinely fine. And some nights everyone was in their separate corners of the small shared space being privately exhausted in ways they did not have the vocabulary to describe to each other. Both kinds of nights happened. The apartment held them all with the same indifferent functionality, and the debt accumulated regardless. The rate sounded extraordinary. A day rate for a major editorial could feed a family of 4 for a month. A campaign contract could theoretically change your life, and for a very small number of women, it did. For the vast majority of women working in the fashion industry in the 1980s, however, the money was more complicated than the rate suggested. Agencies took their commission, usually between 15 and 20%. Tax was withheld, expenses accumulated, portfolio updates, messenger fees, card printing, beauty maintenance that the industry considered professional rather than personal. And between the slow months and the cancelled bookings and the clients who paid 90 days after the job and the apartment that was technically optional but practically mandatory, many models finished seasons having earned considerably less than their day rates implied. The payment timeline in the fashion industry operated on a rhythm that was inconvenient even when everything was functioning correctly. A model completed a job. The agency invoiced the client paid on their own schedule, which was sometimes 30 days and sometimes 60 days and sometimes 90 days and sometimes significantly longer than that, particularly if the client was a large corporation with an accounts payable department that treated invoices from modelling agencies with the same urgency it brought to any other line item in a large budget, which was not much. The money arrived at the agency deducted its commission and any outstanding charges on your account, and the remainder was passed along to you weeks or months after you had done the work to earn it. This timeline created a cash flow problem that was particularly acute for newer models who had not yet built up the booking volume to smooth the gaps between payments. You might complete 3 jobs in a single week and receive no money for any of them for 2 months. In the meantime, you were attending go-sees, accumulating transportation costs, maintaining the appearance that the industry required for professional viability, and living in an agency apartment whose monthly charges were ongoing, regardless of whether any money had come in yet. The debt was structural. It was not a sign that you were managing your finances poorly. It was the financial architecture of the industry, operating exactly as designed. The slow months were a particular challenge, and there were always slow months. The fashion industry in the 1980s operated on a seasonal rhythm that concentrated work around the major show seasons and the production cycles of the major magazines, and the gaps between those peaks were genuinely quiet in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to invoice. A model who had been consistently booked throughout October and November might find January and February essentially empty, and the expenses of January and February were not interested in October and November's productivity. You ate the quiet months. The agency's ongoing charges did not. There were also the hidden costs, the ones that accumulated in the category of professional maintenance, without ever being explicitly acknowledged as industry-imposed obligations. Your hair needed to be a specific colour, or length, or condition. Your nails needed to be maintained to a standard. Your skin needed products. Your body needed the gym, or the specific form of physical maintenance that kept your measurements within booking range, and the gym had a membership fee. None of these were reimbursed by anyone. They were simply the cost of being professionally presentable in an industry that required a specific kind of professional presentation, and they came out of money that was already being divided between the agency's commission and the tax authority, and the apartment and the composite cards and the messenger fees and whatever was left, which was sometimes enough and sometimes not quite. The women who made real money in the fashion industry in the 1980s were the ones who made it to the very top of the booking tier, the ones whose names clients requested specifically rather than selecting from a board, the ones whose rates reflected their individual market value rather than the industry standard. They were real. They existed. They were also a very small percentage of the women who came through the agencies, and the industry's storytelling about money was drawn almost entirely from their experience rather than from the experience of the majority. You heard about the campaign rates. You did not hear, not from the agency at least, about the 90-day payment terms and the accommodation debt and the slow months. You found out about those yourself gradually, on your own statement. The sample sizes were not the only thing that did not fit. The fashion industry in the 1980s had a problem with race that it addressed primarily through selective blindness and occasional tokenism, and the women who experienced it most directly were the ones least likely to be listened to when they tried to describe it. Black models faced booking rates that were lower, career spans that were shorter, and the specific, exhausting indignity of being told that their look was not right for a client without anyone needing to explain what right meant, or whose vision of right was being consulted. The few who broke through did so not because the industry reformed itself, but because they were so undeniable that the machinery of exclusion could not function while ignoring them. The numbers told the story clearly enough, even if the industry preferred not to read them. In the major fashion magazines of the 1980s, the percentage of editorial pages featuring black models was low by any reasonable standard, and it was lower still when the pages in question were the covers, the prestige real estate that determined whose face became the publicly recognized face of beauty that season. Black models appeared. They were not absent, but they appeared with a frequency that suggested inclusion as an occasional gesture rather than as a structural commitment, and the distinction between gesture and structure is the distinction that matters. Naomi Campbell arrived in the industry in 1986 at 15 years old, and her career became one of the most significant and most scrutinized of the decade and the decades that followed. She was extraordinary by any measure. Her physical presence, her movement, her ability to command a frame. She was also subjected to a particular kind of industry racism that operated through the cover gap, the specific pattern by which major fashion magazines repeatedly passed over black models for cover appearances regardless of their professional standing or their commercial success. Campbell spoke about this directly and persistently throughout her career, naming the pattern, identifying the mechanism, and doing so in an industry environment that was not always receptive to the naming and was rarely moved to immediate correction by it. The situation for black models extended beyond magazine covers into the structural distribution of work. Certain clients specified in their casting requests that they were looking for a particular type, and the type was, in the racially uncoded language of the era, understood to mean white and European-looking in the specific way that European-looking had come to mean in the context of international fashion. Agencies sometimes communicated these client preferences to their models of colour directly and without apparent discomfort, as though the preference were a simple logistical parameter rather than an act of racial discrimination with professional consequences for the women being excluded. Asian models faced a parallel and differently textured exclusion, one that combined racial bias with the specific Orientalist aestheticization that the fashion industry deployed in a way it apparently considered complementary. Asian women were occasionally cast for shows or editorials with an explicitly Asian or Eastern theme, which communicated the industry's position with uncomfortable clarity. Asian beauty was acceptable as a category, as a flavour, as a thematic element, rather than as the default standard of beauty that white women occupied as a matter of course. The message was structural even when no individual person in the industry articulated it explicitly, and the women receiving the message received it clearly, regardless of whether it was ever said aloud. What the industry did not do, in any systematic or committed way during the 1980s, was examine the assumptions embedded in its own aesthetic preferences and ask whether those preferences were reflecting genuine universal standards of beauty or simply replicating the racial hierarchies of the broader culture in which it operated. The answer to that question was not complicated, but the industry was not asking it. The women of colour who worked within it navigated the answer daily, with the professional grace that the industry expected from everyone and the additional weight that it placed specifically on them. The word supermodel did not exist at the beginning of the decade in the way it would by the end of it. In 1980, a successful model was a successful model. By 1989, something had shifted. A handful of women, faces so recognisable that they had ceased to be anonymous, professionals and become something closer to public figures, had crystallised into a category of their own. Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington. They were everywhere. They were on every magazine, every campaign, every runway, and the famous line attributed to Linda Evangelista, that she did not get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day, became not just a punchline but a kind of accidental encapsulation of how radically the industry had stratified. A tiny elite at the absolute top, and a very large number of women below them doing essentially the same work for a fraction of the compensation. The supermodel phenomenon was genuinely new in the sense that previous generations of highly successful models had not achieved the same degree of individual public recognition. The models of the 1960s and 70s had been famous in fashion circles and sometimes beyond, but the specific cultural saturation that characterized the late 80s supermodel was different in scale and in kind. These women were not merely models anymore, They were celebrities in the full contemporary sense of the word, recognised by people who did not read fashion magazines and did not follow the industry, whose faces had crossed the threshold from professional currency into cultural symbol. The mechanisms that produced this crossover were specific to the decade. MTV launched in 1981 and created a new visual economy in which faces were consumed at high frequency by an enormous youth audience, and several of the women who had become supermodels appeared in music videos that circulated through this new infrastructure with a reach that no single magazine campaign could match. George Michael's Freedom 90 video, released at the very end of the decade, featured Campbell, Crawford, Turlington, and Evangelista, and is often cited as a crystallizing moment. 4 women so recognizable that their presence in a video in which they did not speak and appeared only briefly was sufficient to make the video an event. What the supermodel mythology obscured, as all mythologies tend to, was the machinery beneath it. The women who became supermodels did not simply rise by virtue of being exceptional, though many of them were genuinely exceptional. They rose through a combination of talent, timing, specific physical qualities that the industry valued highly at that particular moment, the advocacy of specific photographers and editors who elevated them, and an element of contingency that the mythology smoothed over, because contingency makes a less satisfying origin story than destiny. For every woman who became Cindy Crawford, there were many women of comparable beauty and comparable talent who did not, and the difference between those trajectories was not entirely explained by merit. The existence of the supermodel tier also had a depressive effect on the earnings and visibility of everyone below it. When clients could request specific names, they requested the names they knew, and the names they knew were the names that had already achieved cultural saturation, which meant that the supermodels got more work and more visibility and more cultural saturation, and the loop reinforced itself while the large middle tier of working professional models competed for the bookings that the top tier did not take. The industry told the story of the top. The middle told a different story, quietly to itself. The magazine was the product, not the clothes, not the model, the magazine. Everything else, the castings and the fittings and the sleepless nights and the go-sees in the rain, was infrastructure in service of the final image, which was itself in service of the advertisement, which was itself in service of the sale. Fashion magazines in the 1980s were enormously powerful cultural objects, and they used that power in ways that were complicated at best and actively damaging at worst. They set a visual standard for femininity that required airbrushing, lighting, professional hair and makeup, and the structural advantages of a camera angle to achieve, and then presented that standard as natural, aspirational, and available to any woman willing to buy the right products. The fashion magazine in the 1980s was not a small thing. Vogue's monthly circulation in the United States ran into the millions. British Vogue, French Vogue, Italian Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, all of them produced issues of considerable thickness and considerable influence, distributed to readers who returned to them month after month, with the specific loyalty that people extend to objects that tell them who they should want to be. The editorial content and the advertising content were technically distinct and practically entangled, because the advertisers who bought space in the magazine were often the same brands whose clothes appeared in the editorial pages, and the aesthetic standards of the editorial content were calibrated, consciously or not, to the aesthetic standards that the advertisers were using to sell their products. The image-making process that produced the photographs in these magazines involved a level of professional intervention that the final image did not disclose. The model arrived on set and was transformed by a team of specialists into a version of herself that was more precisely what the image required than what she naturally presented. The hairstylist shaped and constructed. The makeup artist corrected and enhanced. The wardrobe stylist dressed and pinned and adjusted, until the garment sat exactly as the photograph needed it to sit. The photographer lit the scene to minimize what the image did not need and amplify what it did. And then the resulting image was retouched, in the 1980s by hand rather than digitally, but retouched nonetheless, smoothed and corrected and adjusted until it represented the platonic version of the moment, rather than the actual moment. The reader who picked up this magazine received no disclosure of any of this process. She received the final image, which presented the version of a woman that had been produced by approximately 12 professionals working across several hours toward a single aesthetic goal, as though it was simply what this particular woman looked like when she stood in front of a camera. The gap between the image and the reality it appeared to document was total. It was also invisible, which was the point. An image that announced itself as constructed would not have created the aspiration that the magazine required to sell the advertising that funded its existence. What the magazines of the 1980s created cumulatively and over years of consistent visual messaging was a cultural standard for women's bodies and women's appearance that was unachievable by design. Not difficult, not aspirational in the achievable sense, genuinely unachievable because it was a composite produced by technology and professional labour and then presented as a natural state. The women reading the magazines absorbed this standard and measured themselves against it, and the gap between the standard and reality was precisely the gap that the products advertised in the same pages promised to close. It was a closed loop of manufactured inadequacy and commercial solution, and it ran through the decade with extraordinary efficiency, making enormous amounts of money for the people who designed it, and extracting enormous psychological cost from the people it targeted. Nobody arrived on set looking like the finished photograph. This was perhaps the industry's most poorly kept secret and also its most vigorously maintained illusion. Before a single camera clicked, before the photographer found his light and the model found her angle, there were hours of preparation in the hands of a team of professionals whose entire skill set was devoted to the project of controlled transformation. The hairstylist, the makeup artist, the stylist who pulled the clothes and steamed them and pinned them and safety pinned them in places the designer had not intended, but the camera would never see. These were frequently the most technically skilled people on set, the ones with the deepest knowledge of light and colour and proportion, and they were also, in the hierarchy of the industry, often the least credited. The hair and makeup chair was where the working day actually began, and it began early. Call time for a major editorial shoot in the 1980s could be as early as 5 or 6 in the morning, because the transformation required time, and the transformation was not optional, and nobody had thought to schedule the light to wait for a slow start. You sat in the chair, sometimes for 2 hours or more for a complex look, while a professional worked on your face and hair with the focused precision of someone who understood exactly what the camera needed and was constructing it from the raw material of your actual face, which was related to but distinct from the face that would appear in the final image. The makeup artists of the era were working in a specific aesthetic vocabulary that was itself a cultural product. The graphic, bold, highly pigmented looks that defined the decade's visual identity. The strong brow, the saturated lip, the contoured cheekbone. These looks required skill to execute and stamina to wear across a full shooting day. They were also, in many cases, uncomfortable in ways that the finished image did not reveal. Foundations that sat heavily, adhesives that pulled, products applied in layers thick enough to be genuinely felt on the face throughout the day. You wore the look without complaint because the look was the product, and the product needed to remain intact through the lunch break and the lighting adjustment and the 4th hour of shooting. The fashion stylist occupied a particular position in the set, hierarchy, simultaneously one of the most creatively powerful people in the room and one of the most under-acknowledged publicly. The stylist was responsible for the clothes, which in a fashion shoot meant pulling pieces from designer showrooms, sometimes negotiating access to samples that had not yet been publicly shown, and constructing the visual narrative of the shoot from those pieces. They understood proportion and colour and the specific language that different garments spoke, and they could build an image from fabric and accessories that communicated exactly the editorial concept the magazine needed. Or they could fail to do so, and the whole shoot failed with them. The relationship between the stylist and the model on set was one of close physical proximity and variable interpersonal warmth. The stylist dressed you, adjusted you, pinned things to your body, and moved pieces of fabric or jewellery around your person with the efficient concentration of someone solving a visual equation in which you were a variable. This was not unkind, it was professional. But it reinforced the set's fundamental dynamic, that the model was the surface on which the image was constructed, the medium through which everyone else's creative vision was expressed, present and essential and not quite the subject. The most extraordinary images from the decade were collaborations between a photographer's eye, a stylist's hand, and a model's body and skill. The credit, when it was distributed, did not always reflect that collaboration with equal weight. Some designers wanted a muse, a woman who embodied their vision so completely that she became synonymous with the house, the season, the entire aesthetic project they were trying to advance. This sounded romantic. In practice, it was a job with no contract, no defined hours, no exit clause, and a very specific emotional labour requirement that nobody acknowledged because nobody had words for it yet. To be a designer's muse in the 1980s was to be permanently available as inspiration, occasionally available as a social companion, perpetually required to look exactly as the designer imagined you, and subtly but consistently reminded that your value was contingent on remaining that image rather than developing into a person who might have her own ideas about what she wanted to look like. The muse relationship had a long history in fashion that predated the 1980s by several decades and lent the arrangement a romantic legitimacy it did not always deserve. The vocabulary around it was the vocabulary of art and inspiration. The designer saw something in you, recognized a quality that expressed his vision, chose you from among all possible women as the embodiment of what he was trying to say. Framed this way, being chosen as a muse sounded like a form of creative recognition, an acknowledgement that you were not merely a body in the right measurements, but a person whose particular quality of presence sparked something in a significant artistic mind. The framing was flattering. The reality was more complicated. What the muse arrangement provided to the designer was considerable. A living reference point for the collection's aesthetic, a walking advertisement for the house's sensibility, a social presence at the right events that connected the designer's name to a specific human face in the press coverage. What it provided to the woman was more ambiguous. Visibility, certainly. Association with a prestigious name, the specific professional credibility of being selected by someone whose taste the industry considered authoritative, but also a set of implicit obligations that were never written down and therefore could never be renegotiated, a set of aesthetic constraints that applied to her own appearance and her public presentation, and the quiet professional risk of being so completely associated with one designer's vision that other clients found it difficult to imagine her in any other context. The dependence that the muse relationship created was mutual in theory and asymmetrical in practice. The designer depended on the muse to embody the collection. The muse depended on the designer for the visibility the relationship provided. But the designer's career did not end if the muse relationship ended. He found another muse, or he evolved his vision in a direction that required a different face. The muse's career, on the other hand, was often significantly shaped by the association in ways that did not fully resolve when the association did. She had been someone's inspiration. Now what was she? The emotional dimension of the muse relationship deserves acknowledgement, because it was real, and because it was one of the mechanisms through which the power imbalance was maintained without ever needing to be stated. Designers who cultivated muses often did so with genuine warmth and genuine aesthetic appreciation, and the women who occupied those roles often felt genuinely seen and genuinely valued in a way that the broader industry, with its clipboard assessments and measurement-driven castings, did not consistently provide. The warmth was real, the appreciation was real, and both of those things made the implicit obligations harder to resist and the implicit constraints harder to name, because naming them would have required acknowledging that the relationship that felt like recognition was also, structurally, a form of professional capture dressed in the language of art. You were someone's muse. It was extraordinary and it was consuming, and it lasted until the vision moved on, and then you were someone who used to be someone's muse, which was a different thing entirely, and the industry had a very short memory for the difference. Nobody told you up front that it was a temporary career. Or perhaps they did, in the fine print of a conversation you were too excited to hear clearly, and you assumed they were talking about someone else. The fashion industry in the 1980s ran on novelty, and novelty, almost by definition, had a short shelf life. A new face was interesting precisely because it was new, which meant that once it was no longer new, it was required to become something else or become irrelevant. The average working life of a model in the 80s was somewhere between 5 and 10 years at the upper end, considerably shorter at the lower end, and the women who aged out of the industry, which was a phrase used without irony to describe women in their mid-20s, were replaced with the same efficiency and the same lack of ceremony with which they had originally been selected. The aging process in the fashion industry operated on a timeline that bore no relationship to the aging process in any other professional context or in biological reality. In the 1980s, the industry's preferred model was young, late teens to early 20s, with the specific quality of youth that read in a photograph as freshness, as potential, as a face that had not yet fully resolved into the face it was going to be. This quality was genuinely difficult to manufacture and genuinely impossible to maintain, because maintaining it required not aging, which was not available as an option regardless of how disciplined you were about your measurements or how carefully you managed your sleep. The decline, when it came, was rarely announced. It arrived through the booking patterns, through the subtle downward pressure on your rates, through the shift in which clients were requesting you and which were requesting newer faces. You might notice it first in the go-see responses, in the way the casting directors looked at you fractionally differently than they had the previous season. Not negatively, not dismissively, but with the particular quality of attention that meant they were filing you in a slightly different category than before. Slightly older, slightly more known, slightly less new. These were not insults. They were simply the industry recalibrating its assessment of where you fit, and the recalibration went in one direction only. The irony was that many models hit their technical professional peak, in terms of skill and confidence and the accumulated knowledge of how to work a set and a camera and a room, precisely in the years when the industry was beginning to lose interest in their faces. The nervous teenager who had arrived at the agency years earlier and been raw and unformed and uncertain and developed through experience and repetition and the 1,000 small lessons of a professional career into someone who genuinely knew what she was doing. And the industry's response to this development was to note that she was no longer a teenager and to begin looking for the next nervous teenager. There was no preparation offered for this transition, no career counselling, no institutional support for the question of what came after. The agency that had managed your professional life and charged ongoing fees for the privilege of doing so had no particular investment in helping you figure out the next chapter, because the next chapter was outside the scope of the service they provided and outside the industry in which their own interest lay. You were sent into the transition with whatever personal resources you had managed to accumulate, which was sometimes substantial and sometimes not, depending on the particular financial trajectory of your career, and the industry moved on to the next phase with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of something that had been doing this for decades and had many more decades ahead of it. You were 25. You were, in the language of the industry that had shaped the last decade of your life, aging out. The phrase was used without irony and received, after a while, without surprise, because the surprise had burned off somewhere around the third season when you began to understand what the timeline actually looked like from inside it. 25. In every other professional context in the world, you were just getting started. The press coverage of models and fashion in the 1980s operated on a logic that was entirely its own. On one hand, it celebrated the women in the industry with the specific breathless admiration reserved for beautiful things the culture simultaneously coveted and resented. On the other hand, it felt entirely comfortable printing detailed assessments of those same women's bodies, relationships, rumoured weight changes, and alleged personal failings without apparent awareness that the subjects of these stories were human beings with access to the publications in question. Fashion journalism at its best documented a genuinely fascinating industry in transition. At its average, it was a vehicle for printing someone's measurements alongside a photograph of them without their permission and calling it a profile. The gossip column occupied a particular place in the media, landscape of the decade, and the fashion world fed it generously. Who was seen where with whom, which model had lost a significant campaign, which face had appeared on the cover of Vogue, and which had conspicuously not, which relationships between models and designers or models and photographers were understood by the industry to mean something professionally significant. All of this circulated through the gossip infrastructure of the press, with the speed and enthusiasm of information that people found genuinely interesting and therefore genuinely compelling to print. The women who were the subjects of this circulation were rarely consulted about whether they wished to be discussed and rarely informed before the discussion appeared in print. The body commentary in the fashion press of the 1980s was so normalized as to be effectively invisible as a category of harm. A magazine that covered the industry felt entirely comfortable noting, in a review of a Runway show, that a particular model appeared to have gained weight since the previous season, or that another had achieved an impressive degree of thinness that was noted with the specific admiring language usually reserved for athletic achievement. These observations were made in print, distributed to hundreds of thousands of readers, and received by the subject in the same way as everyone else received them, by reading them in a magazine. There was no forewarning. There was no right of response. There was simply the observation, stated as fact, sitting in ink on a page that would be on newsstands for a month. The celebrity press, which was expanding rapidly during the decade, treated models with the same appetite it brought to actors and musicians, which meant that the private lives of women who had become sufficiently famous were considered legitimate journalistic territory in ways that the women themselves had not consented to when they signed agency contracts to work in an industry not to become public property. Relationships were speculated about. Personal difficulties were reported. Weight changes visible to anyone who compared photographs from different periods were analysed with a clinical thoroughness that the publication clearly considered a service to the reader rather than a violation of the subject. What the press coverage produced cumulatively was a public narrative about these women that existed independently of their own understanding of their lives, and that they had very limited ability to correct or contest. The industry's PR infrastructure was not primarily oriented toward protecting the models within it. It was oriented toward protecting the brands, the designers, the magazines. A model who wanted to push back against a story that was inaccurate or harmful had very few institutional mechanisms for doing so, and a fairly clear understanding that being publicly identified as difficult was professionally costly in ways that absorbing the inaccurate story was not. Most absorbed the story. Most said nothing. The press continued as it does in the absence of correction, and the narrative accumulated layer by layer into something that would take years to examine and longer still to dismantle. This segment will be delivered with the care it deserves, which means directly, without euphemism, and without the kind of delicate hedging that functioned for decades as the industry's primary mechanism for ensuring that what was happening continued to happen. The fashion industry in the 1980s had a predation problem. It was not a secret. It was not a series of isolated incidents involving a few bad actors in an otherwise healthy system. It was structural, meaning it was built into the power dynamics of the industry in ways that made it predictable, repeatable, and very difficult for the women experiencing it to address without sacrificing the careers they had worked extraordinarily hard to build. The people with the most power decided who worked. The people with the least power needed the work. The structure that enabled exploitation was not invented by the 1980s and didn't end with them, but the specific conditions of the decade, the youth of the women entering the industry, the absence of any regulatory framework, the culture of silence maintained by everyone with a professional interest in maintaining it, created an environment in which predatory behavior by photographers, agents, clients, and designers could operate with a consistency that was not incidental. Young women, many of them minors, arrived from small cities and foreign countries into professional environments where they had no established relationships, no institutional advocates, and a very clear understanding, communicated through the entire structure of the industry around them, that their continued employability depended on the goodwill of the people who had power over their bookings, the test shoot arrangement discussed earlier in the context of portfolio building was one of the primary mechanisms through which exploitation was structured. A young model, new to the industry and eager to build her book, was offered a session with a photographer who wanted to help her, who had connections, who could make introductions. The session was unpaid, framed as a mutual professional benefit, and conducted in a private space with a man who had explicitly positioned himself as someone whose goodwill would advance her career. The invitation to exploit was built into the arrangement's architecture, and the industry's normalization of the arrangement meant that the exploitation, when it occurred, happened in a context that the industry had pre-legitimized. There was no obvious line that had been crossed, because the line had been moved before she arrived. The silence around exploitation was maintained by multiple overlapping interests. Agencies had a financial interest in not knowing what happened between their models and their clients, because knowing created legal and reputational exposure that not knowing avoided. Clients had an obvious interest in the silence of women who might otherwise report them. The models themselves faced a set of professional incentives that made speaking out enormously costly. The risk of being labelled difficult or unstable, the risk of losing bookings, the risk of being removed from agency rosters by people who preferred the problem to disappear rather than be addressed. The industry's informal communication network, which distributed information about models among clients and agencies with remarkable efficiency, was equally efficient at distributing information about models who had made trouble. And the category of trouble included speaking about experiences that the industry preferred remain private. What is owed to the women who experienced exploitation in the fashion industry of the 1980s, and who are owed it by history, if not by the industry itself, is the plainest possible acknowledgement. It happened. It was systematic. It was enabled by the structure of the industry and the silence of its institutions, and the women who experienced it carried that weight through careers and lives that the industry shaped and then largely abandoned without accountability. The reckoning came later, in other industries first, and then, gradually, in fashion too. But the 1980s built the structure. The women of the 1980s lived inside it. The campaign contract was the holy grail. One major campaign, one iconic image, and your face could be on billboards across 30 countries, in magazines on 6 continents, attached to a product that millions of women would pick up off a shelf and associate, however briefly, with the specific quality of beauty you represented. This was extraordinary reach. It was also a transaction with consequences that were not always made clear at the signing. When your face became a brand's face, you entered a contractual relationship that governed how you could present yourself publicly, which other campaigns you could accept, occasionally what you were permitted to say in interviews, and in some cases, what you were expected to weigh for the duration of the contract. Your image, which had always technically been yours, became something administered. The exclusivity clause in a major campaign contract was the provision that restructured your professional life most completely. Exclusivity meant that for the duration of the contract, which could be 1 year or 2 or occasionally longer, you could not appear in advertising for any competing brand within the product category. If you were the face of a cosmetics company, you could not appear in advertising for another cosmetics company. This was commercially logical from the brand's perspective and professionally constraining from yours, because the product categories in fashion and beauty were broad enough that exclusivity could effectively lock you out of a significant portion of the available work for the contract period. And the compensation, while often substantial by any external standard, was being paid in exchange for that lockout as much as for the images themselves. The appearance standards embedded in major campaign contracts were another layer of professional constraint that models absorbed as a standard feature of significant commercial work. Brands that had selected you for a specific look had a contractual interest in the continuation of that look throughout the campaign period, which meant that changes to your appearance, including changes you might have considered personal rather than professional, were in certain cases subject to brand approval. Cutting your hair significantly, for instance, or changing its colour, or altering your physical dimensions in ways that departed from the measurements recorded at the contract signing, could technically constitute a breach of the agreement. Your body, your hair, your face, all of them for the contract period, subject to the brand's preferences rather than your own. The image that the campaign created had a persistence that outlasted the contract itself. A photograph of you from a major campaign could circulate for years after the contractual relationship had ended, in archive editions of magazines, in retrospectives, on second-hand billboards, in the databases of stock image libraries that operated with varying degrees of attention to licensing restrictions. You might encounter your own face attached to a product you no longer represented, in a context you had not approved, years after you had moved on professionally. The image was yours in the sense that it was of you. It was not yours in the sense that you could control where it went or how it was used once it had been created and paid for. The campaign contract gave you visibility and took you a measure of autonomy simultaneously, and the exchange was often worth it professionally, but it was worth examining clearly rather than accepting as simply the cost of success. You signed your face to a brand, and the brand used your face, and eventually the brand moved on and found a newer face, and the billboards came down and the magazines archived, and you were, in the specific sense that the campaign had defined you, no longer the face of anything in particular. What you were after that was a question the contract had not addressed, because the contract had only ever been interested in the image, and images, the industry had always known, were temporary. There were women who said no, not many, in the way that not many people swim upstream in a strong current, not because it is impossible, but because it costs something significant, and the current does not care. In the 1980s fashion industry, saying no to a client who wanted something you were not comfortable with, saying no to a photographer whose behaviour was inappropriate, saying no to an agency that wanted to renegotiate your rate downward because the season was slow, saying no to any of the dozens of small and large requests that came packaged as professional opportunities, meant risking the thing that the entire structure of your career rested on, the good opinion of the people with the power to book you or not book you. and their good opinion, it turned out, was quite sensitive to the word no. The professional consequences of refusal operated through the industry's informal communication network, which was fast, comprehensive, and almost entirely unaccountable. If you declined a job on grounds the client found unreasonable, or if you declined a request from a photographer that the industry would have characterized as standard, or if you raised a concern with your agency about a booking that made you uncomfortable, the information about your refusal moved. Not in any official record, not in any documented form that could be challenged or audited, but in conversations between bookers and clients and photographers who knew each other and spoke regularly, and passed information about the models they had worked with in the shorthand of people who trusted each other's professional judgment implicitly. The language used to describe a woman who had said no was carefully constructed to avoid anything that sounded like punishment, and to sound instead like neutral professional assessment. She was difficult. She was not easy to work with. She had attitude. She was unprofessional. These phrases, deployed in the right conversations, accomplished the work of warning other clients and agencies away from a particular model without ever needing to specify what she had actually done, or to allow her the opportunity to present her own account of it. The woman who had said no to a photographer who had asked her to do something she was not comfortable with became, in the industry's informal record, simply a woman who was difficult, and difficult was a quality that did not book well. The women who understood this system most clearly were often the ones who had been in it long enough to observe its mechanics from the inside, which is to say, they were older, more experienced, and also more professionally established than the women who were most vulnerable to the consequences of refusing. A supermodel with an international profile and a list of campaign contracts could decline a booking and absorb the consequence in a way that a newer model, still building her book, still establishing her agency relationships, still dependent on each booking to prove her continued viability, could not. The protective power of professional status was real, and so was its inverse. The women with the least power to say no were precisely the women who most needed to be able to say it. There were women who said no anyway, regardless of the professional cost, and they deserved to be named as what they were, courageous, in the specific and underrated way that courage operates not in dramatic moments but in quiet professional rooms where the cost of a single word is entirely clear and the word is said regardless. They paid for it professionally in ways that the industry never acknowledged as punishment, and that history has been slow to acknowledge as the price of integrity. They said no. The current continued around them, and they were still standing, which was its own kind of answer. Here is what resilience looked like in practice, because it is worth being specific rather than abstract. It looked like putting on the shoes that hurt and going to the fourth go-see of the day after the first three had ended with a polite but absolute silence that meant no. It looked like sitting in a fitting while a designer's assistant spoke about your hips in a language you did not entirely understand, and keeping your face neutral in the way you'd learned to keep it neutral. It looked like eating enough to function and not enough to trigger a comment from your booker and finding a private piece somewhere in that narrow territory. It looked like calling your mother from a payphone in Paris and telling her it was going fine, when what you meant was that it was going, and that going itself felt like an achievement some days. The psychological labour of working in the fashion industry in the 1980s was not discussed as psychological labour because the vocabulary for discussing it in those terms did not yet exist in wide circulation, and also because the industry had no institutional interest in examining the mental health cost of its own operating conditions. What existed instead was a culture of professional stoicism, a shared understanding among the women in the industry that the demands of the work, including the emotional demands, were simply the demands of the work, and that managing them privately was part of the professional competence the industry expected. You did not bring your bad days to the casting. You did not bring your anxiety to the set. You arrived prepared, composed, and ready to perform ease, and the effort required to perform ease under the conditions you were actually operating in was not credited anywhere and not compensated anywhere, but it was constant. The rejection was constant too. This deserves direct acknowledgement because it is easy to discuss the casting process in structural terms and lose sight of the simple human reality of what it felt like to be told no, repeatedly, by people who were assessing your face and body as the primary criteria of your professional value. In most careers, rejection is mediated by the understanding that you are being evaluated on your work, on things you have done or made or produced, and that the rejection of the work is not the rejection of the person. In modelling, the work was the person. The face being assessed was your face. The body being measured was your body. The rejection, however professionally it was framed, landed in a personal register that was very difficult to consistently insulate against, and the women who stayed in the industry developed a relationship with rejection that ranged from functional detachment to something more costly and more permanent. The friendships formed within the industry were often a primary source of sustaining resilience, and they were often the most honest relationships available in an environment that was structurally dishonest about almost everything else. The women who sat together in the casting waiting rooms, who shared the model apartment bathrooms, who compared go-see sheets and exchanged information about which clients were worth pursuing and which were not, who understood each other's exhaustion without needing it explained, formed bonds that outlasted the careers that had created them and continued in the lives that followed. This was resilience as well, the specifically human kind, the kind that emerges from shared difficulty and shared witness, and the discovery that you are not alone in the thing you thought you were carrying alone, you endured. Not because the industry deserved your endurance, but because you were stubborn and young and had made the journey and were not yet ready to unmake it, and because some days between the go-sees and the fittings and the shoes and the fluorescent light, something extraordinary happened. A photograph that was genuinely beautiful, a show that felt like flying, a moment when all the preparation and all the sacrifice cohered into something that was worth what it cost. Those moments existed. They were real. They did not cancel the other moments, but they were real. And the women who endured were the women who found those moments and held on to them through the longer stretches of everything else. The exit from the fashion industry was rarely dramatic. It was usually quiet, gradual, a series of smaller and smaller bookings that trailed off like the end of a sentence, until one day you realised the sentence had finished. There was no retirement ceremony. There was no exit interview. There was no one from the agency calling to say thank you for the years and good luck with whatever comes next. There was just, eventually, less work, and the understanding that the less was not temporary. The question of what came after was one that the industry had not historically considered its responsibility to help answer, which meant that the women who had spent their most formative years learning a very specific set of skills in a very specific context were left to figure out the translation largely on their own. The formative years question is worth pausing on, because it was one of the most significant and least discussed dimensions of what the exit actually involved. The women leaving the fashion industry in their mid to late 20s had spent their late teens and early 20s inside it, which meant that the years during which most of their peers had been attending university, establishing professional identities in other fields, building the kind of broadly transferable credentials that the wider economy recognised and rewarded, had been spent inside a highly specific professional environment that did not map neatly onto any other industry's hiring criteria. You had learned to walk a runway, to work a camera, to navigate the politics of agencies and casting rooms and fitting rooms and set hierarchies. These were real skills. They were not the skills that a job posting in almost any other industry was looking for. The financial picture at the exit varied enormously, depending on the particular trajectory of the career that had preceded it. Women who had reached the upper tier of the industry the campaign contracts and the magazine covers and the supermodel adjacency, left with financial resources that provided a genuine runway for the transition. Women who'd worked consistently at the professional middle, which was the majority, left with savings that were often smaller than the visible glamour of the industry suggested, because the visible glamour had been supported by the financial structure described earlier: the agency commissions, the debt, the slow months, the 90-day payment cycles. The gap between what the fashion industry appeared to pay its women and what it actually delivered to their bank accounts after the machinery had taken its share was wide enough that many women arrived at the exit in a financially precarious position that the industry's public image made it difficult to explain to people outside it. What the women who left the industry did next covers an enormous range of human possibility, from the women who moved into adjacent creative industries to the women who reinvented themselves entirely in fields that bore no relationship to fashion. Some became agents and bookers themselves, translating their industry knowledge into the institutional roles from which they had previously been managed. Some became photographers' assistants or stylists or makeup artists, staying close to the work while shifting their position within it. Some went back to school, starting the educational journey they had deferred when the agency scout had appeared in the mall with a card and a promising sentence. Some married, had children, built domestic lives that were quieter than what had preceded them, and sometimes exactly what was needed. All of them were 20-something women figuring out who they were when the industry that had defined them for the better part of a decade had quietly moved on. The transition was harder than it looked from outside and more possible than it felt from inside, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any significant human transition. Change in the fashion industry in the 1980s was not a revolution. It was more like a series of small cracks in a large and confident structure. Cracks caused by women who were tired or angry or both, and who decided that being tired and angry out loud was preferable to being tired and angry privately while the structure remained intact. Some of these women were models who gave interviews that their agencies had not approved. Some were editors who began asking different questions in their publications. Some were photographers who worked differently. Some were designers who cast differently. None of them, individually, changed the industry overnight. But taken together, across the decade, they left a record. They left evidence that it was possible to notice what was happening and to say so. The interview was one of the primary instruments of quiet resistance available to models who had achieved sufficient public profile to be sought out by journalists and sufficient professional security to risk the consequences of candour. When a model with a significant public profile said, in a published interview, that she had been told to lose weight before a major booking, or that she had experienced behaviour on set that she found inappropriate and that the industry had not addressed, or that the financial structure of agency contracts was less favourable to models than the industry's public image suggested, she was doing something that cost her something professionally and that contributed incrementally to the record that would eventually be used to examine the industry's practices more critically. The interviews accumulated. The record grew. The structure did not change overnight, but the case against it was being built. Naomi Campbell spoke about racism in the fashion industry throughout her career in the 1980s with a directness that the industry found uncomfortable and that history has found prophetic. She named the cover gap. She named the differential booking rates. She named the specific ways in which black models were excluded from the mainstream of an industry that simultaneously claimed to celebrate beauty in all its forms. She did this in an environment that was not receptive to the naming and that had significant institutional capacity to make the professional consequences of the naming clear. She did it anyway, repeatedly, across years, in the specific sustained way that changes things eventually even when the immediate response is resistance. Her voice was one of the most important of the decade in the fashion context, and it was deployed at personal professional cost that the industry has been slow to fully acknowledge. The health conversation began to change as well. though slowly and incompletely. By the late 1980s, enough individual voices had spoken about disordered eating in the context of fashion industry pressures that the subject had entered the public record in a way it had not been in at the decade's beginning. Journalists began writing about it. Doctors and psychologists began commenting on it in the context of broader public health discussions about eating disorders. The industry itself was largely defensive in its responses, attributing the problem to individual vulnerability rather than structural pressure. But the conversation was happening in a way it had not been before, and conversations about structural problems once started are difficult to permanently silence. The designers who began to cast differently, who looked at a runway and decided that the aesthetic of extreme thinness was not the only possible aesthetic, who hired women with ranges of body types and backgrounds that the industry's default settings did not produce, were making creative choices that were also, whether they framed them that way or not, political choices. The casting of a runway is a statement about what beauty means in a particular moment, and the designers who widened that statement in the 1980s were pushing against the decade's prevailing definition in ways that mattered cumulatively, even when they were invisible individually. The change was slow. It was incomplete. It is still incomplete, but it started somewhere, and it started with women who were tired and said so, and with the small, stubborn cracks in a large and confident structure that eventually let the light through. The women who moved through the fashion industry in the 1980s left something behind that was not always visible at the time and has only become clearer with distance. They left behind the images, of course. The campaigns, the editorials, the runway photographs that defined a decade's visual vocabulary and still appear in retrospectives and museum exhibitions and coffee table books. But they also left behind something less polished and more important. They left behind the testimony of what the industry actually was, collected across decades of interviews and memoirs and quiet conversations that eventually, gradually, became loud enough to hear. They paid, in many cases, an enormous personal price to build the spectacle that the rest of the world admired from the outside, and the least the rest of the world can do tucked in, comfortably at whatever hour this is reaching you, is know that the images endure with a specific quality that is worth examining honestly. The photographs from the major fashion campaigns of the 1980s are genuinely extraordinary documents, technically accomplished, aesthetically bold, products of a specific cultural moment in which fashion was taking itself seriously as an art form and producing images that justified the seriousness. The photographers were talented, the stylists were skilled, the art directors were ambitious, and the women in the photographs were remarkable, not simply because they were beautiful, though many of them were, but because they brought to the images a professional competence and a human presence that the camera required and that no amount of technical skill on the part of the crew could manufacture without them. The images are beautiful. They were also made at a cost that the images themselves do not disclose. The physical legacy for some of the women who worked in the industry during the decade is documented in the way that physical legacies are documented, in medical records and in the private conversations of people who lived through consequences that were not publicly visible. Bone density affected by years of insufficient nutrition, joints damaged by years of ill-fitting footwear across hard surfaces, the specific long-term effects of chronic stress on systems that were young and still developing when the stress began. The fashion industry of the 1980s did not conduct studies on the health outcomes of the women who worked within it, and this absence of institutional inquiry was itself a choice, made by an industry that preferred not to examine the long-term cost of its short-term aesthetic preferences. The women carried the cost in their bodies. The industry carried no corresponding record. The cultural legacy is more complicated and more contested. The images of the 1980s contributed to a visual culture that shaped how a generation of women understood their own bodies and their own adequacy. in ways that researchers studying body image and media influence have been documenting since the decade ended. The impossible standard that the magazine images set, constructed by professionals and presented as natural, filtered through millions of households and into the mirrors of millions of women who measured themselves against it, and found themselves falling short in ways that were by design and that nobody was disclosing. The women in the photographs were not responsible for this. The women in the photographs were, in many cases, themselves measuring themselves against the same images and finding the same impossible shortfall. The harm ran in multiple directions simultaneously. What the women of 80s fashion left behind, finally, is the record of having been there, of having moved through an industry that was brilliant and brutal and indifferent and occasionally extraordinary, of having built careers under conditions that were not designed for their well-being, of having produced work that mattered and endured while absorbing costs that were never accounted for. They deserve the full accounting, the one that holds the beauty and the damage in the same frame without looking away from either. They were there, they did the work, they walked through it in shoes that hurt, on runways that were slippery, in front of people who looked at them as surfaces and in spite of everything produced something that was unmistakably human. That is their legacy, complicated, costly and real. And tonight, wherever you are, in whatever comfortable arrangement you have found for yourself in the dark, it is worth knowing. And so here you are, still breathing, probably horizontal, possibly already half asleep, which is exactly where you're supposed to be. Tonight you travelled through a world that glittered from the outside and asked a great deal from the inside. You walked the go-sees and the runways and the fitting rooms. You sat in the fluorescent light of the casting call and stood against the white wall for the Polaroid and waited in the model apartment while the debt accumulated quietly on a statement nobody warned you about. You wore the shoes. You kept your face neutral. You performed effortlessness across an entire decade of effort. And you did it in heels, across multiple boroughs, in weather that did not care. The women of the 1980s fashion industry were not fragile. Let that be the thing you carry into sleep tonight, above everything else. They were young, many of them very young, and they were frequently alone, and the system they moved through was not built to protect them or sustain them or prepare them for what came after. And still they showed up. Still they walked. Still they sat in the chair at 5 a.m. while someone constructed a version of their face for a camera, and still they stepped through the curtain into the light and made 70 seconds look like the most natural thing in the world. They built an aesthetic vocabulary for a decade that the rest of us still reference. They walked through rooms full of people who assessed them as surfaces and produced images that were unmistakably human. They navigated racism and exploitation and the specific grinding daily weight of an industry that measured their worth in inches and found reasons to renegotiate downward. And they navigated it with the professional grace that the industry demanded and the private reserves that the industry never acknowledged and could not have manufactured if it had tried. Some of them are still here, in their 50s and 60s now, living lives that bear varying degrees of resemblance to the lives the industry shaped for them. Some of them made the transition and never looked back. Some of them are still making it. Some of them are the ones who eventually spoke, whose voices contributed to the slow reckoning that the industry has been conducting with itself, incompletely and imperfectly, for the decades since. They were not just the images. They were never just the images. Behind every campaign and every editorial and every 70-second runway walk was a woman with a go-see sheet and a composite card and a bathroom schedule and a phone call home and a quiet, stubborn refusal to stop entirely, even when stopping would have been the rational choice. That stubbornness is a form of courage. It deserves to be named as such. So tonight, as you sink into the particular luxury of a bed that belongs to you, in a room where nobody is discussing your measurements, in a life where your worth is not printed in cold black type at the bottom of a 4x6 card, take a moment. Not for the glamour of the decade, which was real, but was also constructed by people whose names were not always the ones that appeared in the credits, for the women inside it, for what they gave and what it cost, and what they carried out the other side. They kept walking. The least we can do is remember that they were more than the walk. Good night.